Welcome to the Visual COBOL in a Nutshell series of presentations. This module will provide an overview of using projects and solutions within the Visual COBOL for Visual Studio product. Within Visual Studio, a project is the standard unit of work. Each project contains one or more source programs or resources that are built into one or more executable modules. Each project contains a set of properties that apply to the files contained within that project. A solution is a container for projects. It allows you to group and maintain multiple projects within a common location. Visual COBOL provides a set of project templates that can be used as a starting point for a variety of project types. These categories are Cloud, allowing you to create .NET managed applications that can be published directly as Microsoft Azure Cloud Services. Database, allowing you to create .NET managed stored procedures using COBOL that will run within SQL Server database. Manage provides templates for creating .NET managed code applications such as Windows Forms, Windows Presentation Foundation, and Windows Services. Native allows you to create standard Windows.exe and .dll files, as well as Micro Focus proprietary int and gent code. And Web allows you to develop ASP.NET web applications and controls, as well as Windows Communication Foundation service applications that will be hosted under IIS. Let's first explore the topic of solutions. Within a solution, you can create new projects of any type and also manage existing projects. Solution folders can be created to help group common projects into a single location. Solution properties allow you to specify a startup project that should be used when you start debugging. You can also set dependencies and the order in which projects should be built within the solution. The Configuration Manager can be used to create and manage various build configurations which control how projects should be built. These configurations can then be selected to allow for quickly changing between a 32-bit and 64-bit build, for example. Let's take a closer look at Visual Studio Solutions. This is Visual COBOL for Visual Studio 2012. In order to create a new project and a new solution, you can go to the File menu under New Project, or if you have the Start page up, you can also select New Project from there. Okay. Now, if you're using the Visual Studio Shell Edition that comes standard with Visual COBOL, you will only see COBOL under the list of templates. You will not see these other languages. But since I'm using a professional version, which is the Premium 2012 edition, I do have these additional Microsoft languages also. Okay. Under COBOL, we have the categories that we spoke about previously: Cloud, Database, Managed. There are a variety of templates under Managed. Same with Native. And Web applications such as ASP.NET and WCF. For our demo purposes, we'll just create a native console application. We can go down here and give our new project and solution a name, or just accept the default name that is given for us. By default, the solution will have the same name as the project, but they don't have to have the same name. And we can give it something more meaningful here. We'll just call this my main app. You can see it changes the solution name to be the same. You can put this anywhere you want. I have selected a folder that exists on my C drive called My Projects. You can give this a new name as well, and it will create that folder for you. Now, if you're using a single project only within your solution, you might want to uncheck this box here. This box causes a separate directory to be created, a separate folder, just to contain the solution. And this is important if you have multiple projects so that they'll be at all the same hierarchy level. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. So here we're going to work with multiple projects, so I keep that checked and click OK. And our project will be created along with our solution, and we'll be presented with a skeleton program so we can begin to work right away. Okay. If we look over here, all our project management is done within the Solution Explorer. If this window is not available, you can turn it on by clicking on the toolbar up here, Solution Explorer, or you can find the same option under the View menu, Solution Explorer right here. Okay. We can take a look at what is created for these. We can see in our My Projects folder, we now have a folder called My Main App. This is the solution folder because we selected to have a separate solution folder. Okay, the solution file has a .sln extension. If we look at that, we can see it's just a text file. This is in the Visual Studio solution file format. This can be used with the MS Build utility from the command line. So that you can build your solutions and projects after you create them in Visual Studio from outside the IDE. Okay, we have a folder here for our project with the same name. The COBOL projects are given the extension CBL-proj. If we look at this, we can see it's just an XML file containing various bits of information about the project. And again, this can be used with MS Build to build the project outside of Visual Studio. Okay, there's some other folders here that we'll cover later on. Okay, in order to add new projects to a solution, you can right-click on the solution name itself and go to Add New Project. Now you can add any type of project into a solution. It doesn't have to be the same type. It can be a different language. It can be managed code, or it can be C#. So they don't have to be the same type. Here we'll do what we do in a common scenario. We have a main project that creates an executable, and then we can create some DLLs that executable will call. So we'll create a native project with type link library, which will create a DLL. And we can give it a new name, but I'll just accept the name and location here by default. So we've created a new project for a DLL. We can do that for an additional one or more if we want. And so we'll create link library 1 and link library 2. Okay, in order to build these, you can right-click on the solution and select Build Solution. That will build whatever has changed since the last time we did a build. If you select a Rebuild Solution instead, that will force a rebuild of everything. So a build solution is an incremental build, and rebuild is a build all. Okay. This is also available over here from the Build menu item, or from the toolbar, Build Solution here. Okay, if you had a number of projects, a large number of projects in your solution, and you wanted to not work on all of them, and it was getting slow to build them, you might want to unload these, and you can do that by just going down and saying Unload Project. That keeps the project within the solution itself, but it makes it unavailable, so it will be ignored in the build. In order to load those back up, you can just say Reload Project, and then it becomes available to you once again. Okay, if you wanted to actually delete a project or remove it from the solution, you can do that by right-clicking on the project name and saying Remove it. Okay. Now this removes it from the solution only. The project still remains on disk. If I go back here and take a look now at what's been created, we have a project for each of our, a folder for each of our projects. And link library 2 is still here, although it does not appear within the solution. If we wanted to add it back, we can right click on the solution itself and say Add Existing Project instead of New. And we can go to where that is, and we just select the CBL-proj, which is the project file. And that will add the project back into our build, into our solution. Okay. If you had a number of projects that are common, like here we have DLLs, if we had a large number of these, we could create a solution folder in which to group them. We can do that by saying add, and we can say new solution folder, and we can give it a name here. We'll call it my DLLs. Okay, and now we can move these in by just dragging them over. So I drag it from here into the folder. Same with link library 2. So now these projects show up under this folder, making it easier to maintain. So you can close them or open them when you're working on them. Now this is a virtual folder. It didn't affect anything on disk. If we take a look at our projects here, we can see link library 1 and link library 2 are exactly the same location that they were previously. So this is only for grouping the projects within the solution itself. Now you can also add other items that are unrelated to this, any of the projects by just saying add and a new item. So if we wanted to, for instance, add a text file, a README file in, we could do that here. So we could add a number, and they show up under Solution Items folder. Okay. So we could add an additional one here, new item. Again, we'll add another text file, and it shows up under Solution Item. Or we can create a new folder to put that in. We could create our own solution folder called READMEs, or whatever you wanted, and move those items in like that. Okay, now these will be located within the solution itself. So if we look at our solution folder, the My Main app, we can see that's where those text files, anything that you add to the solution goes into the solution folder. Okay, for properties, since we have multiple projects here, when we start debugging, we need to set one as the start app, and normally that would be the console application, which is our EXE, because a DLL you would normally need to call. In order to change the startup project, you can either right-click on the project and say Set as Startup Project. Then it will be highlighted here, like this. Or if you click on the solution and go down under Properties, you can also set the startup project here as well. And the configuration. There's always a debug and a release configuration created by default. If you wanted to do some more advanced properties, you can go up here under the solution and click on here it is, property pages, and we can bring up some common properties such as the startup project here. Now, some versions of Visual Studio allow you to say current selection. This, anytime you click on within a file within a project, that will automatically make that project the startup. That sometimes when you only have one startup project, that can be a little annoying. So you would set instead just a single startup project and select it from here, so it'll always be the startup project. If you had multiple startup projects, like multiple executable projects, you can select this here, and you can have an action applied to each one, whether you want to start it with or without debugging, or no action. And you can also change the order that these will be selected. Okay, some other options that you can use, project dependencies. Since our main console depends on these DLLs, we can click here that it depends on those, and that way those will be built first when you do a build all for the solution. Okay, some other properties, configuration. Here by default for native apps, x86 is used as the default configuration type. That means it's a 32-bit app, and everything is selected as build. So when you do a build selection, it will build all the projects. You can turn these off if you wanted to, when you did a build solution, to ignore certain projects. Okay. The deploy here is only for projects that have a deploy capability, such as web apps, whether or not you want to deploy them every time they're built. If you wanted to create a new configuration, say for 64-bit, you can click on Configuration Manager, We'll save our example here, and we can create a new solution platform here by clicking on New, select X64, and then within this new platform that we're creating, we can say how to build each of the projects. So for each one, we want to create a 64-bit as well. Okay, so now when we select X64, it'll build a 64-bit version of each of these. Okay, if we apply it, that becomes the new default. And you can see that you can select that now up here in the configuration window. There's now a 64-bit and an x86, so you can switch between 32-bit and 64-bit quite easily. And when you do that, if you look at the properties for the project, the platform target will change automatically for each of the projects. Let's now change our focus to projects. Using the Solution Explorer window, you can manage the source files and resources that make up a project. Each project is associated with a build configuration, and files recognized as COBOL source code will be compiled into an output module. Each project has a set of properties that control how that particular project will be built. This includes settings such as compiler directives, generated code type, and output folder location. A virtual view can be used to group files with a specified extension into a common folder for ease of use. A project detail view is also provided to allow you to view file details such as last modified timestamp and to sort and search for files by name or file type. Let's take a closer look. Okay, so here's a visual COBOL solution called My Projects, in which I have two actual projects. One is a .NET Managed console application, and the other is a native code console application. Each one has exactly one program in it at the moment. If we look at this on disk to see how this is arranged, we can see we have our My Projects folder containing our solution, and then we have a folder for each of the projects. The source code for the managed console is kept in its folder along with its output folders, and the same goes for the native code. So they're kept separate in separate project folders even though they're in the same solution. Okay. When we go to manage these, we do so from within the Solution Explorer window. Adding files to the projects, we can do that by right-clicking on the project name and selecting Add New Item, and we can select from a list. Here we're interested in COBOL programs. We'll just select the default name here. We could change that if we wished, and we'll add a couple of those. New Item, Program 2, and one more. Add New, Program 3. Okay, now these have actually been created in the project folder. If we take a look at that, we can see here's our new programs. Okay, to manage these, if you wanted to rename one, you could right click on it and say rename and give it a new name. Now this is affecting the name in the project in Visual Studio as well as the name on disk. We can see our new name here. Okay. If we wanted to delete a file from a project, we could right click on it and say delete. Now you have to be careful with this because this deletes it from the project, but it also deletes it from disk. We can see that our MyProj is now gone. If you wanted to remove a file from the project but still keep it on disk, you can do that by instead saying exclude from project instead of delete. That removed program 2, but if we look on disk, program 2 still remains. So you got to be careful with delete. Okay, if you want to add existing files to your project, you can do so in the same manner. Instead of saying new item, you say existing item, and then it lets you go to where the location of those programs. So here you can select one or more using the shift and control along with the mouse. By default, you would add these to the project, which means it would make a copy of the files and move them to the project folder. You can also say that you just want to create a link by saying add as link, and that will keep the files where they currently are and just put a link into the project pointing to that exact copy of the files. But here we want to actually add them in, so we'll click add. Okay. If we look on disk, we can see that these are now part of our project folder. Okay. Now our subprog 1 has some copy statements in it, and we can see our background parsings telling us that this is an error because it can't find those. You can add copy files in the same manner. Add existing item. You can go to where your copy files are and select those and either add them to the project or add them as a link. And you can see the error goes away because it recognizes as soon as the copy files are part of the project. Now as you start adding more and more files to your project, you can see it becomes a little confusing over here, trying to find out what's what. We've added a view that we call virtual view to a project. If you select it, it will group certain files by their extension. Here we can see now there's a folder for COBOL source containing everything with a CBL extension. Other extensions supported are shown down here in the properties window. And under copybooks, all the copybooks will be grouped under that folder. And here you also have the extensions. Now you can add file extensions in here by going to Tools, Options, and under Text Editor, Advanced for Micro Focus, you can put in all the copybook extensions that you want if you have some non-standard ones, and then they'll be recognized in the virtual view as well. Okay. Now these folders don't actually exist on disk. They're just virtual. If we look back at our project, we can see that our files are still all in the same folder. And you can turn that on and off as you would like. Okay, we also have another view called the Project Details window that you can open up, and it gives you a way of looking at your files that are within your project, allowing you to sort them by name or by type. You can also get information such as when it was last updated, that particular file. And it even allows you to filter this by searching. So here it'll just give us everything that has subprog, prog 2 in it as a search string. Okay, onto project properties. If you double click on the properties page for the project, it'll bring up the properties window. We'll go over some of the more commonly used ones. Output name refers to the name that will be generated for the executable. On disk, this can be changed. By default, it has the same name as the project. So here it would generate mynativeConsole.exe. The output type is the type of application. These can also be selected when you select the project template that you want to generate when you create the new project, but you can change them afterwards also. So if you change this to link library, it would create a DLL instead of an EXE. Same goes for int gent, it will create an INT or a GNT. Okay. Output 2, single executable, is the default. That means if you have multiple programs, as we do here, they'll all be compiled and generated into the same executable. If we look at our output folder here, which is, we can see there's only a single output file name called native main. Okay, if we change this to multiple executables and we rebuilt the project, if we look at it now, we'll have an exe for each of the CBL files, each of the files in the project. So it'll generate one for each source. This is more common with DLLs. If you have a number of source files and you want to create a DLL for each one. Okay, we'll set that back to single executable. The environment tab, if you want to set environment variables when you run this from within the IDE, you can set environment variables like cob config or extfh, some of the system environment variables, or even environment variables you use to assign file names. You can set them right here, and they'll be picked up when you debug or run from within the IDE. They will not affect it when you run outside of the IDE, however. Okay. If you have multiple programs, you might have to set the entry point to the starting program, and you can put that in right there. On the SQL tab, it's just a convenient place to put in SQL directives if you are using embedded SQL in your programs. You can do it from here. You can still also do it from within a directives file or within the program itself. Copybooks, instead of adding all the copybooks to the projects, you can specify a location to find them, and this will be the same as putting in like a copy environment variable. It will search the locations that you specify here, the folders. Okay. Now, copybooks that are added this way will not show up in the virtual view. Only copybooks that actually exist in the project will show up in the copybooks folder in the virtual view. Okay, COBOL Link, number of options here. Again, you can override the output name. Runtime model. If you used NetExpress in the past, you'll see that there's one missing here. No longer supported is the static link model where everything is linked into a standalone exe. So it'll always load in the runtime system, which is a separate DLL, CBL RTSM.dll for native applications. Single-threaded is no longer supported either. It always uses multi-threaded. The difference between shared and dynamic, if you click dynamic, when you run this outside of the IDE, it will search the registry looking for the installation folder for Visual COBOL in order to find the runtime. If you only have shared specified, it will search the path, the system path, looking for the runtime files. Okay. If you have additional objects that you want linked in, you can specify them here. Same with libraries. If you have third-party libraries or Windows, you're making Windows API calls, you can add those libraries here. Okay, debug, various ways of starting the debugger. For more information on this, see the Visual COBOL in a nutshell presentation on debugging. Okay, and the COBOL tab, a number of important things here. Platform target. You can choose to create for native code x86 or x64. x86 is 32-bit, x64 is 64-bit. The way you would normally do this is by changing the platform configuration to choose either one. And when you change this, you can see that the output path also changes. So x86, if you change it to x64, it'll go to a new folder. So you can switch easily between them. Okay, in configuration, there's always a debug and a release configuration. The difference being that in the debug, it turns on this compile for debugging checkbox, which down below actually turns on the directives anim and cobidy, which enable debugging. If you change that to release, the option to compile for debugging is not on, and you no longer have those debugging directives turned on. Okay, change it back to debug. The dialect, the default dialect to use, Micro Focus is the default. You can choose any of these others. Source format, this will actually affect the margins on disk. So if we look at our native main, we can see it's set to fixed, so you get these margins to the left and right of area A and B. If you were to change this to, say, variable, and then you bring up your source again, you can see the right-hand margin disappears. So this actually affects the editor as well as the compiler, how it's compiled. Okay, set that back to fix. Couple other items, the warning level. If you're bringing your programs over from NetExpress, you might see warnings in Visual COBOL that you didn't see before. That's because in NetExpress it was using this level E as the default, and now it's set to warnings. So if you want the same compatibility with NetExpress, you would change this to level E. Okay. The output path, this tells it where to put the generated file. By default, it's put in this bin folder, which is relative to the project folder. That's why it uses the /. That means relative to the project folder. Sometimes you might need to change this. If you have multiple projects that reference the files, like an EXE project referencing the DLLs in another project, you might need to change these so that they reference the same folder. You should not use a full path name in here. You should instead always use relative. That makes it easier to move these projects around and lessens the dependency on an actual path. If you wanted to make it dependent of the solution folder, you would just say .. and then you could put something like output dir, something like that, and that would be relative to the solution folder. Okay. If you want a listing generated, you can just click that. If you have additional compiler directives, you can put them in here. Okay. For managed code projects, it's mostly the same. There are a couple things that are different. You have an assembly name, which is the name of the executable. A namespace in .NET world, you use namespaces to organize your classes, and under the covers, even if you have a procedural program, it becomes a class. Your target framework, you can target any of the .NET frameworks that are supported by your version of Visual Studio. Output type, here you can change it from a Windows app, a console, or a class library, which is will generate a DLL. Okay, startup object. If you have more than one program, you can select the one. It's the same thing as like an entry point. SQL tabs, the same as native, same with copybooks. Namespaces. If you want to reference classes in the .NET framework or other classes, you can select their namespaces here, and this will allow you to reference the class names without fully qualifying it with the namespace. It's the same thing as if you were using IL using directive in your source, or in C# you have a using directive that does the same thing. Okay. The other difference in the platform targets, for managed code you have an additional one. You have any CPU, which means to generate the assembly. So if you're running it on a 64-bit system, it will run as 64-bit. If you're running it on a 32-bit system, it will behave as if it's 32-bit. Okay. Everything else is pretty much the same here. And that brings us to the end of this presentation of Visual Studio projects and solutions. Thank you for watching, and happy programming.